Until last fall, I'd never heard of Bayard Rustin, the man responsible for conceiving and organizing the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom that gathered 250,000 people, black and white, from around the country to the National Mall. The march that reinvigorated the civil rights movement and gave Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. the platform for his most famous speech, "I Have a Dream." The march that pressured Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act preventing discrimination based on race, color, sex, religion, or national origin. It was a tremendous feat of organization and logistics, requiring fundraising, nonviolence training, bringing together and overcoming the competing commitments and egos of various leaders and groups within the civil rights movement, of balancing the urgency and passion of the young with the caution and wisdom of the older generation, and all in less than 10 weeks. I first encountered Rustin's story in an article by Adam Gopnik published in the November 13th issue of The New Yorker. And then suddenly his name was everywhere. A musical, a book of essays, a Netflix documentary about him were all released in the last year. And I watched the documentary, which was produced by Barack and Michelle Obama. And President Obama described Rustin as the backbone of the March on Washington and a model for anyone who does community organizing. So given his importance to the civil rights movement and social justice work, why is his story only emerging now? Well, there are a couple of reasons. Primary was his sexual orientation. Homosexuality wasn't just frowned upon in the 1950s and 60s when Rustin was at his height as a leader. It was a crime, actively pursued by the police. Rustin had been arrested in 1953 in Pasadena, California, for lewd conduct after being found with another man in a parked car. And he served 2 months in jail and was registered as a sex offender. Beyond that, as Gopnik notes, homosexuality was more anathema to the existing Black power structures, with its roots both in the evangelical church and in northern big city clubhouse politics, than it was to the likes of J. Edgar Hoover. One has the sense that for Hoover, it was one club among many with which to beat agitators over the head. Red, queer, it was all the same. But enemies of Rustin within the civil rights movement, among them Adam Clayton Powell Jr., the Harlem congressman and power broker, were motivated by a genuine abhorrence of gay men. Rustin's sexual orientation was more than a political liability. It was an existential threat to some of the other civil rights leaders. For being of one marginalized identity doesn't automatically make one supportive of those of another marginalized identity. Homophobia can be as present in communities of color as it is in the general American culture, just as racism can be present in the LGBTQIA+ communities. The power of white supremacy culture depends upon this, depends upon splitting and pitting groups of people, fighting discrimination and injustice against one another. Bayard Rustin and Dr. King first worked together in 1956 to organize the Montgomery bus boycott, and they became good friends. Their gifts complemented one another. Dr. King's oratory skills gave powerful language and expression to the call for equal rights, while Rustin's ability to imagine and organize the how made them a powerful force. And such was the threat that the powers that be, including J. Edgar Hoover and Senator Strom Thurmond, remember him? Leaked stories of Rustin's homosexuality to the other civil rights leaders, implying that Rustin and King were lovers. Rustin went to meet with King, resignation in hand, assuming that King would be alone and would not accept it. Instead, he found King there with other civil rights leaders who pressured King to accept Rustin's resignation. Feeling brokenhearted and betrayed, Rustin left the meeting and did not speak to King again until he was convinced by Ella Baker that they needed one another for the 1963 march to have any chance of success. Another strike against Rustin was his brief affiliation with the Communist Party in the 1930s, which he joined while in college in New York City. He realized quickly, however, that the party was controlled by the Soviet Union, which was using it to serve its own ends, and did not have any real interest in supporting a separatist black nation or black equality in general. Instead, Rustin went to work with A. Philip Randolph, president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the first successfully led African-American labor union. And Randolph taught Rustin the power of community organizing. Together in 1941, they planned a march on Washington to protest segregation in the defense industry. And hearing of their plans, President Roosevelt issued a preemptive executive order banning discrimination in the U.S. defense industry, recognizing the potential disruption of such a protest. Randolph and Rustin canceled the march. They planned another one in 1943 that led Truman to do the same, this time integrating the armed services. Under Randolph's tutelage, Rustin learned the importance of detail, as well as the tedium involved in community organizing, how to maintain energy, morale, and commitment over the long haul, how and when to compromise, and how and when to stand firm in one's principles in pursuit of a shared vision or objective. For while the moral arc of the universe may bend towards justice, it is indeed long. Perhaps another reason Rustin's story was lost was because he was a principled pragmatist rather than a charismatic visionary idealist. He was born in 1912 just outside Philadelphia, raised by his grandmother, a member of the African American Society of Friends. Brought up in the Black Quaker community, Rustin learned skills required to find consensus in community decision-making. He understood the importance of listening to one another, to the ethics, to the moral arc, also to which the Spirit calls us, so as to find a common ground. As Gopnik observes, with no set dogma available, members of the Society of Friends have to consult their inner light to navigate, and the many boats are expected to knock against one another as they glide. The necessary schismatic nature of the civil rights movement, encompassing godless socialists as well as evangelical Christians, was exactly the right place for someone with a Friends background to flourish. I love this line. Finding a way from individual crankiness. We don't know anything about that. Finding a way from individual crankiness to a working consensus was a regular Quaker practice. In organizing the March on Washington, Rustin found himself constantly having to battle balance competing commitments of the various constituents involved, particularly managing the gap between the idealism of the young people in his war room, whom he called his angelic troublemakers, who were doing the work on the ground and who wanted immediate results with no compromise, and the political demands of the power brokers in the back room, like Roy Wilkins, head of the NAACP, and A. Clayton Powell Jr., who had President Kennedy's ear and didn't want to lose it. At the same time, as a Quaker, Rustin was very principled. He was imprisoned for 2 years as a conscientious objector, refusing to fight in World War II. He believed in human dignity for all persons, and that this could only be achieved through nonviolence and by building coalitions that found common ground to raise all boats. For this reason, he advocated hard for economic equality, recognizing this as the goal that could support a broad coalition across race, ethnicity, religion, and gender. The 1963 March on Washington was his vision made real, bringing together not just leaders of the civil rights for blacks, but union leaders for workers' rights. It was called the March for Jobs and Freedom. Just days before the march was to happen, South Carolina's Strom Thurmond gave a speech on the Senate floor revealing Rustin's arrest in Pasadena for perversion and insinuating again that he and Dr. King were in a relationship. Rustin was again called in by Dr. King to an emergency meeting of the organizing council, which included Randolph and Wilkins, John Lewis of SNCC, Whitney Young of the Urban League, who by the way was a member of the Unitarian Church in Atlanta, Georgia, James Farmer of the Congress of Racial Equality, Representative Adam Clayton Powell Jr., and Dr. Ann Hedgeman, the only woman on the committee. Once again, Rustin was pressured to resign for the greater good of the cause. Rustin refused, knowing the march would fail because he was the only one with the skills to pull it off. And the Netflix documentary does a powerful job portraying his desperate plea to this group, trying to make them understand. And he lists all the details of everything he has done so far for this march, making sure there was a sound system, latrines, enough water stations, training the corps of over 1,000 Black New York City police officers to provide nonviolent security in the face of the violence they would encounter from both whites and blacks. Ordering sandwiches for the marchers made with peanut butter and jelly and not cheese because he knew cheese would go bad in the heat. Organizing all the parking for all the buses, putting out the map routes for everyone coming in from all over the country, overcoming the threats and racism of the chief of the Capitol Police who refused to allow the National Park Service to work with him, and who told him that the National Guard and the Army would be there instead with guns. Rustin walked out of that meeting, followed by Dr. King, intent on persuading his friend to listen to reason. And Rustin turned to him, and this is a documentary, so a movie, so I'm going to trust that it's real. Martin, you are one of the smartest men I know. So explain to me why after all that's left undone, I am yet again forced to justify my existence. Each of us are taught in ways both cunning and cruel that we are inadequate, incomplete. And that the easiest way to combat that feeling of not being enough is to find someone we consider less. less than because they are poorer than us, or because they are darker than us, or because they desire someone our churches and our laws say they should not desire. When we tell ourselves such lies, start to believe and live such lies, we do the work of our oppressors by oppressing ourselves. Strom Thurmond and Hoover don't give a blank about me. What they really want to destroy is all of us coming together and demanding this country change. Then he asked King, "Are they expecting my resignation?" King says, "Some are, yes." "Then they are going to have to fire me because I will not resign. On the day I was born black, I was also born homosexual. They either believe in freedom and justice for all, or they do not." Part of Rustin's genius was his awareness of when to be practical and compromise, and when to stand fast. Reading Gopnik's piece and watching the documentary, I thought we could really use someone like Rustin right now. In our polarized times, when so much is at stake, a leader and an organizer, grounded in faith and principles with a clear vision of what is right, while also practical and aware of the hard work, the attention to detail, and the compromise required to find common ground for change at the pace of the moral arc. As Gopnik writes, the principles that Rustin held steadfast, though they may seem unexciting in a political culture that loves romantic extremists, they are nonetheless time-tested. Work within a coalition as broad as you can make it. Emphasize logistic efficiency. Relish the metaphoric imagination, but don't let it run away with your judgment. Accept that perseverance is the best friend of freedom. Although utopianism and visionary overreach may be necessary beacons of freedom, they, left to their own devices, become its betrayers. So maybe that's why Rustin's story is being recovered now, because it's the one we need to hear and remember. Dr. King often quoted Theodore Parker, a Unitarian Universalist minister, an abolitionist of the 1850s, about the moral arc of the universe being long but bending towards justice. Rustin knew that while the moral arc bends towards justice, it is long, and that we constantly and pragmatically need to engage that.